You hear about the big names, right? You hear about Martin Luther King Jr. and all the big figures, but really when you look into Freedom Summer, you see that it was a grassroots movement. Why is my question. Why is it that we're waiting so long to hear about something so significant, something so important?
I mean, the focus was on, I would say, the big milestones, because you only have so much time to teach.
It's a luck of the draw whether or not SNCC is mentioned. They did not get the recognition and that they should have, but they were very essential to a lot of the groundwork done.
Americans tend to have learned a childish version of civil rights history, what historians sometimes call the heroes and holidays approach. Julian Bond used to joke that to many Americans the civil rights consisted of Rosa sat down, Martin stood up, and the white kids came south and saved the day. But what really happened in the civil rights movement from the mid-50s to the mid-60s was that tens of thousands of everyday people, maids and farm workers and mechanics and bakers and waitresses, just irregular everyday people, put their lives on the line, risk having their houses firebombed, their kids shot, in order to make the civil rights movement happen and gain the very basic rights that the Constitution says we all should have. History tells us who we are. I mean, who would you be without your memories? And a community is the same way. What makes somebody, however they identify, is the shared past that that group of people has. So I think it's so important that you can never ever get away from it. History's like physics, it's always at work on us. Historical societies are crucially important for the general public. Everybody doesn't do historical research, everybody doesn't make films and write books, but vast numbers of people watch documentaries, vast numbers of people go to museums. The best-selling form of nonfiction is biography. And so people are continually engaging with the past.
When you look at civil rights education, in most cases, I mean, the focus was on, I would say, the big milestones, because you only have so much time to teach each unit. SNCC is oftentimes left on the side, would be one of those topics, because you got to cover King, you got to cover Malcolm X, you got to cover Freedom Summer, you got to cover the different movements that were there, so that you can then move to Watergate, and I mean, there's a progression to it.
We don't hear about all the things. We hear about freedom rides and the sit-ins, but we've never heard about SNCC, or at least I haven't. Why is my question. Why is it that we're waiting so long to hear about something so significant, something so important like the civil rights movement? Of course, there are many people behind the scenes that you wouldn't, hear about. But this was such a big organization because it was ran by young students our age now who wanted to see a difference. And I think that, especially in this day and age, it should be taught.
I first learned about SNCC through Dr. Anderson Bricker with the thesis activity. What we did in that class, we had a choice between studying the civil rights movement or European history. So I chose to go down the path of the civil rights movement. What I learned initially was how they seemed to be the grassroots organization. They were the ones who were out with whether the voter registration drives or working with people from a humanity standpoint or human dignity standpoint. They were the ones who were out there getting the message out, as opposed to necessarily being the headliners in every situation. They were kind of the ones doing the day-to-day work.
The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee has been called the shock troops of the civil rights movement. It was composed mostly of young people, students, or people who had recently been college students in their late teens and early 20s, who were impatient with the slow pace of change. They thought that the way to change society was to put your body on the line. Don't try to get laws to change segregation, break the laws. And one of their most noteworthy accomplishments was to get their activities covered in the national media so that Americans all over the country would be outraged by the state of segregation in the South.
How I would describe SNCC is that they were a very essential supporting group. I personally don't believe that they got the recognition or the fame that they should have. They are definitely an underdog figure in our history, but they were very essential to a lot of the groundwork done.
SNCC was quite a bit different than other civil rights organizations because it came out of the student sit-in movement. The student sit-in movement basically was a 1960 movement where students tried to desegregate lunch counters by taking over those lunch counters and sitting in. And out of that, this group of college students organized into the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. They went from being a direct action type group to a group that was organizing people to make change in their own lives. They called themselves a cadre, African American and white activists who basically identified local people and gave them skills in community organizing. And eventually then those people would demand change from local, state, and national government. So what they believed they needed to do was essentially create leadership in local communities. And so Freedom Summer was one of the projects that they engaged in.
We hope to send into Mississippi this summer upwards of 1,000 teachers, ministers, lawyers, and students from all around the country who will engage in what we're calling freedom schools, community center programs, voter registration activities, research work, work in the white communities, and in general, a program designed to open up Mississippi to the country.
Freedom Summer was an excellent example of how grassroots people, the population at large, were willing to take risks. That's why we called the exhibit and the book Risking Everything. It's from a phrase of Bob Moses. It said, it doesn't take a revolution, it just takes a number of people willing to risk everything to make social change.
And I think it is really interesting to study because so many students were involved. They left their homes to go to Mississippi and work with the communities there.
How do you get the nation to pay attention to Mississippi? That if we can get white college students to come and potentially those white college students getting injured by Mississippi white Southerners, then because those were the sons and daughters of the elite of America or the middle class of America, that then those parents would force the federal government to pay attention to what was going on in Mississippi.
I'm just old enough to have fragmentary memories of seeing it on TV in the summer of 1964.
Did you talk this over with your parents before you made the decision?
Yes, right. I discussed it with them. And they felt, of course, what I feel, and that is fear of what might happen there.
With the murders, of course, it is always hard to talk about things like that, especially with younger students. But I think it is important to talk about the murder of Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner.
The murders were something very sad. These people who were essentially targeted and then killed, police didn't really show very much of an interest. It was just one of those things where they kind of just tossed at the wayside because of the fact that they wanted to help and segregation.
And this happened right at the beginning of the summer. Right? So there were volunteers still in Ohio for their training, and they heard that these 3 civil rights workers disappeared. And for a lot of them, it was clear that disappearing meant they were murdered, that they were dead somewhere and the bodies were hidden. That also sets the mood that the people were in. Right? You're a student that is getting involved, you're about to go down to Mississippi and you hear that that happened. On the one hand, it shows you how important this work is. On the other hand, it also shows you how dangerous the work is and how serious. You're not going to summer camp. And they still went down to Mississippi and faced the state. So they were really serious about what they were doing, and they really wanted to go there. They had a reason to go.
I'm down here because I believe that my freedom is very much entangled with the freedom of every other man, and that if another man's not free, then I'm not free. So I'm fighting for my own freedom here.
Are you scared?
Yes, I'm very much afraid. Everyone here is. But we knew before we came down something about what it's going to be like, and I don't know of anybody that's turning back because of things like this that happen.
The architects of Freedom Summer the previous fall had thought that if white volunteers came down and were the ones getting their heads beat, that would change the way the movement was understood. And I don't know if they really anticipated that the white volunteers would be kidnapped, tortured, and murdered. They certainly knew it was possible. But for it to happen on the first day was a terrible shock for everyone.
On Thursday, President Johnson ordered sailors from Meridian Naval Air Station to augment state and federal law officers who were conducting the search. There have been reports that they were seen in other states. None of these reports proved out, and so far, neither has the search.
Disappearance and ultimately the realization that they had been murdered absolutely shocked most of America. And throughout the summer there was great tension as people watched the news to find out what had happened. And then in the months that followed, the trial of the perpetrators again shocked people. It would be a shame if their murders were turned into some kind of celebrity icon, because in fact other people died in Mississippi that summer. And black people had been dying across the South for decades and decades, and it didn't even make the local press, much less the national press. So I would hate to see too much attention paid to those three murders and none paid to the thousands, it's literally in the thousands, of other murders that had occurred beforehand.
What's wrong with these people? 1964, when America was at war with itself.
In Mississippi Freedom Summer, what they wanted to do is to use these hundreds of volunteers that came to Mississippi to also work on real problems, like how do we get massive numbers of people registered to vote? How do we actually make up for the problems in the educational system of African American Mississippians? And how do we actually get the Democratic Party to face up to the fact that it too is racist? So they're doing all kinds of things, all the things that SNCC thought was important, they're doing in this one event.
In Mississippi, there was effectively only one party. There were no Republicans, because after the Civil War, the Republicans were the party of the North and Lincoln, and so they were the enemy. And they remained the enemy for decades and decades and decades. So politics, from party caucuses to local elections up through national elections, were run by the Mississippi Democratic Party. They were, of course, segregationist, white supremacists of the worst sort who enforced segregation so that the horrible conditions in Mississippi that we read about today remained in place. And as part of Freedom Summer, SNCC leaders thought, if we make an alternative Democratic political party that plays by all the rules of the National Democrats, we can just represent Mississippi in the National Party and replace the illegal segregationist people who've been controlling politics. So they created an organization called the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party.
We have scheduled precinct meetings and district caucuses. And on August 6th, here in Jackson, we will hold our state convention. At that time, we will elect a slate of delegates to the National Convention in Atlantic City.
They held caucuses, they elected delegates, and they went off to the National Convention of Democrats in Atlantic City, New Jersey that August. It was a presidential election year. Johnson was going to be the Democratic candidate and Barry Goldwater the Republican candidate. And they appeared in Atlantic City and said to the power brokers at the top of the Democratic Party, the segregationists representing our state have no legitimacy because black people were not allowed to choose them. We are the only representatives who played by the National Democratic Party's own rules with open elections and open meetings, and so we should be seated in the National Convention. Well, of course, this shocked and outraged everyone. There were 2 days of hearings at the convention of who should represent Mississippi.
And if the Freedom Democratic Party is not seated now, I question America. Is this America? the land of the free and the home of the brave, where we have to sleep with our telephones off of the hook because our lives be threatened daily, because we want to live as decent human beings in America. Thank you.
The Democrats, led by Lyndon Johnson, who needed the Southern traditional segregated representatives to get his other programs through, didn't want to risk losing the votes and the support of the Southern segregationists. And so he engineered a dismissal of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party so that they could not represent the state at the convention. The Democratic Party leadership suggested a compromise where 2 members of the Freedom Democratic Party could sit. But of course the racist, white supremacist, traditional members were not going to sit next to any black people, and they walked out. And the SNCC-inspired Freedom Democratic Party said, we didn't come all the way from Mississippi for 2 seats. You know, we deserve all the seats. We're the only ones who played by the rules, and they did not get that, and they walked out too. So the Democratic Party really betrayed its own principles and the principles of the US Constitution, and rejected all of what Freedom Summer was about.
When it comes to success or failure, some historians argue it's a failure because there isn't any legislation that comes out of it, and the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party does go to Atlantic City. They do challenge at the convention, and they are given 2 seats. They wanted to integrate the entire delegation. They all wanted to attend because they had been elected by the citizens of Mississippi in an integrated fashion. And so some call that a failure because they weren't able to reform the Democratic Party. And of course, the problems in Mississippi didn't change. But on the other hand, Mississippi Freedom Summer is a success because it transformed the lives of thousands of people. Not only were the Mississippian black individuals transformed by encountering white people who treated them with respect and learning new skills, but many of those white college students went on to be involved in all of the other social movements we associate with the 1960s. And so in that sense, there was a great deal of positive, transformative consequences, even if we can't measure it in September 1964.
We see SNCC today. We see their experience. We can learn from their experience, whether it's through like Black Lives Matter or whether it's other organizations or other causes.
The climate in the United States it's very much looking for equality. What does equality mean? How can it be shown now? Is it better or worse than previous times? I think it's just a full picture. There's 2 main ways to look at the civil rights movement. Was either it was a period of time in the 60s where this is what happened, or the civil rights movement was just a step on the ongoing journey for true civil rights and equality. So I think it will always be relevant in our country.
One of the greatest lessons that I saw someone take from our exhibit about Freedom Summer was something said by a middle school kid, a 12-year-old, who had to spend a class period looking at the panels like the one behind me here that we circulated around the country. Anyway, this middle school girl turned to her teacher after having spent a class period with it and said, "I never knew my grandmother had to be so brave," which was fabulous because she learned about the past and her grandmother, but she also learned that she could be brave too.
I think the public can learn how involved students were in the movement. And that was just people like you and me who went down to Mississippi and get involved because they thought what was going on was wrong.
I think from Freedom Summer, I think one of the things that they can learn is that social reform is possible, that humans can come together and they can change values or systems that they no longer want to be part of the American way. I think it shows that people from different backgrounds can come together and that they can stand above their differences, but actually then work together to create change.
It's especially important for college-age students to learn about Freedom Summer because it was people very much like you who went south and took a stand that ultimately changed America.